I'm going to, ladies and gentlemen, talk to you about three things. I'm going to, first of all, talk about the drivers and motivators that cause us to develop and adopt what we might call digital technologies. And I'll also talk about the societal challenges of that adoption. Then I'm going to ask the question, and hopefully answer it a little bit as well, is AI different to the other digital technologies? And then I want to finish with three things that I think that we all collectively need to focus on if we are to continue to get the benefits of these digital technologies rather than be suffering the potential disadvantages. So if we want to make the most of it, what are some things that we should concentrate on? And I will choose three. You might listen out in my speech for something that I've just heard coined, which is not just digital technologies, but industrial digital technologies, which is, even to me, is a relatively new expression. First of all, I do want to spend a moment describing my background and where I came from, not because I enjoy hearing it, but because I think it's important to know where do people come from when they're talking to you, what's shaped their experiences. For the last 5 years or so, I have been the Director General of the Digital Technologies Industry Association in Brussels, representing the industry in European policymaking. And before that, I did that job in the UK. And now, as our moderator eloquently introduced me, I, amongst other things, chair a global digital foundation. And I suppose what I really like about that is that I don't have to grind any axes, if you know what that means. I don't have to take any particular point of view. I can be dispassionate, disinterested, and objective, and that's what I hope I can be with you this afternoon. Let me talk to you just very briefly about the Global Digital Foundation and its mission. Indeed, it is tempting to bring different sections of society, academia, industry, government together to focus on the opportunities and overcoming the barriers to the harnessing of digital technologies. That's its focus. And a plug, if you want to work with us on any particular projects, we're always keen to look for partners all around the world. We have people in every geography, and we are keen to work with people who want to also bring their efforts to bear to take advantage of digital technologies. I also work with an organization called Burson Marsteller, and this is interesting for me because this gives me a chance to work directly with their non-tech clients who are going on the digital journey, looking at the factory of the future, the application of artificial intelligence, the application of Internet of Things. So I really like this because it gives me the opportunity to complement my theoretical base in the foundation with practical experience of working with a wide range of customers on their digital journey. So, to the subject of this afternoon's speech. One of the other things that I did when I was Director General of Digital Europe, I was, on behalf of the European Commission, the president of a strategic policy forum looking at the digital transformation of Europe's industrial base, the digital transformation of Europe's industrial base. And when I was beginning this forum, which had representatives from all parts of the community, from civil society, from industry, from academia, and so on, I was looking for some sort of inspiration to help me set the goals of the forum. And I chose this. He may not be familiar to you, this guy, but this is a guy called Willie Sutton. And Willie Sutton allegedly said, when asked by the police, why do you rob banks, Willie? He was a serial bank robber. He answered, because that's where the money is. And when I looked at that as an inspiration for our forum, the digital transformation of Europe's industrial base, the reason that I chose him was because I also wanted to focus on where the money was. And in Europe, the greatest opportunity for the application of digital technologies is in the transformation of its industrial base. It's in the improvement of the productivity of those great industrial companies, of improving their competitiveness, making them continue to be world beaters. And you see it in great companies like Siemens, totally adopting digital technologies to remain a world leader in its class. And you heard earlier from our colleagues at Boeing doing the same sort of thing. You know, digital transformation is one of the big prizes. Anyway, enough of Willy. I think having pictures of bank robbers up behind you all the time is not really a good idea. I know that Daniel's going to talk to you about some studies later on that talk about the benefits that you get from digital technologies, but a new one I came across only in the last couple of days came out of my home country, the United Kingdom. There was a new study that came out only the last couple of days called Made Smarter. And I quite like that. That's quite a catchy title because that implies that we're making it smarter, but it's also about smarter making, smarter manufacturing. And what that study finds, which was led by industrialists in the UK, is that what they call industrial digital technologies, and they include robotics and artificial intelligence and many others as well, it has the opportunity over the next 10 years to add 175,000 new net jobs to the UK. 175,000. So that's accepting that these technologies will replace some jobs, but there will be more created, 175,000 simply in the UK, and that it would also bring about a 25% increase in productivity. But let me not be too sort of UK specific. This issue of the adoption of industrial digital technologies is a global opportunity. And let me just tell you a little story. I was in the Hanover Fair. Every year in Germany, there is a manufacturing fair. And this year it was concentrated only, really, on the application of digital technology. It was quite amazing. And I was there with the European Commissioner responsible for launching this work on the digital transformation. And I met an old friend of mine who runs an organization called the Industrial Internet Consortium. And he explained to me that this consortium was bringing together companies who were looking at issues like the application of robotics, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, the factory of the future, if you will. And he said to me, a year ago, the majority of those companies were American companies. He said, 1 year later, we have more than 100% increase in the number of companies. 1 year later, and the minority now are American companies. So still a big minority, but nevertheless a minority. So this adoption of industrial digital technology is going on apace around the world. And it's not just business opportunities. I also had the opportunity to talk to somebody who is called the Chief Digital Medical Officer for a very big American healthcare provider, an integrated healthcare provider called Kaiser Permanente. I think they're a $60 billion organization. And he was explaining how the adoption of these integrated digital technologies into their organization was enabling them to be able to deliver new care to their patients within 24 hours of a discovery. I mean, really quite remarkable the effect that digital technologies were having on the healthcare sector. It's not just the management that think that. I was very struck by some remarks from the Director General of the European Trade Unions. And you know, in Europe, organized labor is a very powerful component, and he identified some global challenges. But what was interesting, he said, we need digital technologies to help us tackle these sorts of problems. And I thought that was very interesting that the labor movement in Europe is identifying the opportunities for digital. But nevertheless, we don't all see it that way, I think. So there are drivers, but what about the acceptance of digital technologies? I was struck by, I was at a conference speaking to a group of entrepreneurs, maybe 100 people in the room, and I said, who wants to change the world? And everybody, of course, puts their hand up. Yes, we want to change the world. And I said, and who thinks the world wants to be changed? Not so many hands went up, because we've seen over the years that it's okay to want to change other people. I'm not sure I want to change myself, thank you very much. And there's been resistance to the application of new technologies throughout history, whether it was the steam engine or, I mean, Sir Robert Peel was the UK British Prime Minister. He was born in the late 18th century. And he said something to the effect that we might wish to have a Britain comprising of cornfields and not cotton mills. We might prefer an agricultural to a manufacturing population. But, he said, our lot is cast, we cannot recede. In other words, the die is cast, we are set on this path. We are going down this whether we like it or not. Not everybody would agree with that. This is a picture supposedly from the middle of the 19th century. This was the Silesian miners' revolt. Silesia is an area that I think now is on the German-Polish border. And these miners were revolting about the application of new technologies into their world. I guess that would have been steam engines, because steam engines were replacing some of their jobs. But what was interesting was that the revolt wasn't really about the application of technology. It was because in other parts of the world where they had introduced technology, they had become more productive, and so business was moving away from this area, causing job loss. So this was an example, an early example, where if you don't keep up with the application of these technologies, you will fall behind. This is 200 years ago nearly. So I think all I would say is not everyone wants to go along with the change and the adoption of digital technologies in the way that some of us might wish, and we have to bear that in mind. So having talked then about the opportunities for digital technologies, sometimes the lack of acceptance, what do I think about, is AI any different? Now, I think, Dr. Kim, you mentioned, hard and soft AI. I quite like the definition of narrow and broad AI, but let's call them small and big AI, just for the sake of it. So I don't want to talk really about big AI. What I want to talk about is little AI. But I might, if I have a moment, come back to big AI, where if you think about how we work, how the human mind works, we take information or data, we process it, and we draw conclusions and we act. So you might say it's about data, process, and acting. Let's come back to that issue of big artificial intelligence in a moment. Let's just for a moment talk about little AI or narrow AI, because when we are talking about artificial intelligence, in most of the things we talk about, we are really talking about narrow AI. And by that, I mostly mean machine learning. And I mostly mean the neural networks that are learning. And they're very precise and very targeted. And in a way, I think what we've got is not AI, we've got lots of little bits of narrow AI, whether that's winning at chess, or in fact some better examples might be, and I think, Daniel, you have some examples of the application of AI, but one I saw recently was artificial intelligence that was looking at very specific images of people with diabetic retinopathy, which is where the retina starts to have hemorrhages as a result of diabetes. And this artificial intelligence was trained to be better than ophthalmologists at detecting the signs. That's a very precise and specific, and I would say typical example of narrow AI, small AI. And to me, that sort of thing is no substantially different to the sorts of advances in digital technology that we've seen elsewhere. You will hear, and I think, again, Daniel, you have some references to a study from Frey and Osborne, who 4 years ago frightened the world with these, which is why we're having this debate today. Will all the jobs disappear? They frighten the world with their studies. But I think that this sort of narrow AI will have no more effect on our jobs than other sorts of digital technologies. Now, that's not to underplay them, but it's simply to say we need to look at it in that regard, not single out narrow AI as any different, really, to the other sorts of technologies that we've had and we've been dealing with for the last 200 years. And it's not I don't have to look very far to find studies to support that. There was, again, a recent study, from the UK, from the Royal Society of Arts. Its full title is Royal Society of Art, Manufactures and Commerce, a very comprehensive report studying lots of businesses that makes pretty much the same argument as I have just now. Now, in a moment, let me move to those the three things that I think we ought to be focusing on. But before I do that, let me just move back to the big AI for a moment. You know, you could think about what we do as being, we take data in, we process it, and then we decide on our actions. And what wonderful things we human beings are, because we can take data from all over the place. We don't have to be told what data to take in. We absorb it from our experiences, from what our mothers have told us, from, I don't know, how we feel. AI can't do that today. AI is rubbish at taking in a wide variety of different pieces of data. It can be very narrow. You know, one of the things that AI really struggled with in the early days, had to train it a lot with the data, is simply to distinguish between cats and dogs. That is a really, really big challenge, a typical challenge for artificial intelligence. I don't think even one of our 2-year-olds would have any problem distinguishing between cats and dogs. Now, in theory, AI could go on and eventually be able to absorb all the data, be better at processing than us, and come to conclusions more quickly. But I would say that's not something we ought to be worrying about. That's the stuff of science fiction, the singularity. I think we should be thinking about narrow, small AI and what that means, just as we do with other digital technology, to specific tasks and specific aspects of jobs. I think that's where our focus needs to be. And so the three things that I will come on to really focus on how do we deal with that in the same way that we dealt with other digital technologies. Let me turn to these last 3 points and say 3 things that I think we maybe should focus on. I've got just little examples of each behind these as well. I'll be very quick. So what I mean by these is, can we educate people generally about AI and its potential so that they know what to leave in the realms of science fiction and they know what they're talking about? I've got an idea for that. Can we, and we've had a lot of discussion about this, continually improve our competencies and skills as human beings in order that we can take advantage of small AI just as we've taken advantage of other digital technologies? But we need to be able to, just as we for a long time have needed to master our tools to be able to succeed in life, these are just new tools we need to master and know how to take advantage of them. And finally, can we regulate and control? And by that I don't mean we must regulate and control. I mean, can we work out how to best regulate and control these technologies in the way that we always have? Let me just sum up. Can we find the right path to making the best of these digital technologies for our future well-being? That's our goal. I've explored a little bit the motivation, the imperatives for using these digital technologies. It's not going to go away. We are going to continue to use these things. We do need to take people with us. We don't want miners' strikes. We don't want taxi drivers on the streets having riots, throwing firecrackers at us. Think about artificial intelligence in terms of small AI, narrow AI, not this world of science fiction. And the response needs to be, get a better understanding of artificial intelligence, improve our human skills to use the tools that are available to us. We had to learn how to use a hammer and a nail. We can learn how to use artificial intelligence. And please, let's try and avoid a knee-jerk reaction to regulation. Let's really think about how society should set the rules for these tools, just as we've done in the past. Take our time and get it right. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will leave it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So this is basically what I was asked to do. The future of jobs of publication predicts a loss of 5 million jobs due to robots and artificial intelligence. So my first thought was that didn't seem like such a large number. But we have heard much bigger numbers, 3/4 of jobs, so many jobs that will exist that don't exist now, et cetera. So that was a lot. There's been an emphasis on that. So the question is, how extensive and what is the nature of that loss? If there is a loss, how can government adopt appropriate systems and policies that can solve this job reduction problem? So that's the broader question, and that's what we're dealing with in this panel. My particular focus really is on higher education, and in particular on low-income students. Now, we've heard a lot today from Boeing, from Google, from Intel, from Stanford, from Northwestern University, from Helsinki University. These are elite institutions in our society. And when nobody likes to make a prediction, I will make this prediction. I think those institutions, those types of institutions, will thrive in this change. They will be able to figure out how to deal with these technological changes. I think if you listen to the people today, you would have confidence in that. So the question I have is, what percentage of the population do we need to think about in this? Is 25% of the population adequate to deal with these changes? That's pretty much what we're talking about when we're talking about the institutions we've been hearing from today. So I want to ask you, listen to these presentations for the rest of this conference, and ask who in your society is going to be touched by these changes, the elite or everybody? Now, I want to say that I think that in order for us to respond to these changes, I think all of our society needs to be able to address those issues as well. So I think that's what, now I do want to say, I think I agree with John with respect to the loss of jobs. Yes, AI will definitely take jobs away in some areas. I mean, we used to have 40% of our population was on the farm 100 years ago, now 2%. So there was that automation did take away many jobs. But I think in the aggregate, that's a much more difficult question to answer. Now, all right, what is happening with automation? Well, okay, this is the cover of the New Yorker magazine from last week. Okay, now this is truly an apocalyptic view of robotics. It means that robots will even drink our lattes. If we really think that robotics and AI are going to have a major impact, what are we going to see? I don't hear people talking about how we're going to consume less. So we're going to consume more, but we've lost all those jobs, so presumably our productivity is going to be much higher. Has that happened? No, that has not happened. This is, at least in the United States, this is a graph of productivity. The thick blue line on the bottom is the graph of our growth of our productivity since the end of the recession, or the beginning of the recession, 2007. Pretty anemic. If you look at the middle line, that's the trend of productivity growth basically since World War II, since 1947. So you can see, had we continued on that, our productivity would have been much higher over the last 10 years. Now, the top line are more recent, say from 2001 to 2007, and I think there is an argument maybe that the third industrial revolution has had significant productivity effects. The introduction of the internet and other kinds of software that's had those effects. So that's one thing. So I guess my question really is, what's going on here? I mean, maybe we want more robots. If we think productivity is a good thing, right? We'd like to see that. So that's really a question. I don't know. I have to people who are thinking about this. Now, that's not saying that we don't have anything to worry about in terms of employment. So one of the things that sort of technological optimists have said, they've pointed out that over the last 100 years, despite all of the changes in technology, we've actually seen continued growth in the percentage of the population that's employed. So not only have there been more jobs throughout that century, but the percentage of population with jobs has increased. So those are significant questions. The question I think we have is, we want to make sure that the decline in labor force participation is not because there are jobs there and workers do not have the jobs that are the skills necessary for those jobs. That's the question I've got to do. Now, certainly I think education can address these things. It can't do it alone. Now, let's just look at what happens. These are personal earnings. The top line is for is for a bachelor's degree or for a four-year university degree. The bottom line is for students who only have a secondary school degree. So we can see that in terms of the earnings, in terms of the benefit, the financial benefit of these degrees, they are strong. They continue to be strong, although the earnings aren't really growing, so that may be something to be concerned about. But so we might say, well, let's have more students complete higher level degrees. That might be a good point, but we have one thing that stands in the way of that is that our education system is very unequal. Now, actually, if you saw this presentation before, President Shapiro talked about the Raj-Chetty data, and he made the point that students from the lowest tenth of the income distribution who go to the most elite schools have a 52% chance of rising to higher levels. Well, that's a good point, but we have to look at how many of those low-income students actually have access to this. Now, this is a chart about the Ivy League, or called the Ivy Plus. I don't think any of you would say that these institutions are not capable of responding to the changes that we're facing. So good, we have the answer. Well, 14.5% of the students in those institutions come from the top 1% of the income distribution. So if you're rich, you have a good chance of going. And what about this? 13.5% come from the bottom 50%. Just think about that. More students come from the top 1% who go to the Ivy Plus institutions than from the bottom 50%. So yes, if you come from the bottom 50% and you're lucky enough to get into those institutions, yes, that's great. But there are very few who do that. What do we do about that? This is a bit of a different, that's sort of an extreme case, but this this shows some different institutions. Harvard, one of the Ivies, UC Berkeley, which is a competitive, a very selective public university, SUNY Stony Brook, which is a less competitive or less selective public university, and Glendale Community College. You can see here this graph shows the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Those are the parents' income quintile. So the parents come from the lowest quintile of the population. And so you can see here there's a stratified situation, right? If you're low income, you're more likely to go to a community college. Now let me say a little bit about a community college. I am, after all, the director of the Community College Research Center. Community colleges are basically two-year institutions. They do two things. They train people in specific occupational preparation, and they also train students or educate students who want a four-year degree, so they're going to go there for 2 years, and then they'll transfer. But the crucial thing about that is that these are the institutions that enroll more low-income students. So what I want to say is if we think that all of the population needs to be able to address and respond and adapt to the changes we're talking about, it's institutions like community colleges that we need to think about. Now, community colleges are somewhat unique, but certainly in Korea and other countries who are here, have institutions designed to train people for occupational or technical skills. And presumably, I would guess that those are the types of institutions that lower income students tend to go to. All right, this is something else. This shows the amount of money that's spent. How much are we spending? So this is a complicated, but the left-hand graph are the private research universities, and the right-hand one are the public community colleges. Look at the dark blue. What that means is that we're spending almost 4 times as much per student at the private research universities than we are at the community college. All right, now, how's that changing? This shows the change in 10 years of that expenditure. So we have a system where the more high-income students you have in that institution, the more money you spend on that. And that inequality or that change in financing is actually getting worse. So go back to the point. If we think that all of society, that all of our students need to be able to address these changes, and that means that we need to look at the institutions like community colleges. Nevertheless, they have the least funding, and that funding is declining relative to others. All right, now, despite that, community colleges are a good investment for students. You can see that it makes sense for them to go to community college. Their earnings will rise, will be higher than if they didn't. But the problem is since they have so little funding, they don't have the services to really allow students to stay. So only about a third of community college students actually get a degree in 6 years. Now, I don't know your situation in Korea or other places, but nevertheless, if you have a set of institutions that enroll students with lots of problems and that come from less resources, and you don't invest in those, this is the result that you're going to get. Now, we've written a book that talks about what to do about completion, but just to end up here, I want to emphasize the types of skills that are necessary. Yes, we need to get students to the end, and if we could get more of those students to graduate from those institutions, that would be, I think, go a long way towards addressing the issues we're talking about today. But at the same time, we need to think about what skills are that ought to be taught. Now, what I'm going to say, I think, has been said several times today already, so we don't have to say too much, but there's been several speakers who've talked about the difference between specific skills that train you to work. Now that's also maybe in occupational areas, but President Shapiro also talked about that as an economist, versus more general skills, soft skills, entrepreneurial skills. And what they do, though, is that they allow you to adapt to changes that take place. So if the jobs that we have today won't exist 10 years from now, what is it that we're going to learn? Whatever skills that we learn today will no longer be useful. So we need to teach skills that allow people to adapt to that. Now, just in the last 2 months, there have been 3 books published that sort of make the idea that the general skills, or what we call liberal arts education, is in fact the best preparation for employment. You can do anything. Surprising power of a, quote, useless liberal arts education. A practical education, why liberal arts majors make great employers, and finally, maybe this person should have been invited to this, robot-proof higher education in the age of artificial intelligence. So I think these make the argument that we've been hearing all day. The problem is if you read these books, once again, it's going to be in the types of institutions that enroll higher income students, not all students. I think you've probably seen these types of, I like the one on the left, which is from the Future of Jobs survey, the one that predicted there would be $5 million loss. And I think if you look at these things, you'll see that that same report calls for the types of skills that robots are not likely to have. Right? There's another research which talks about the importance of cognitive skills. This isn't just something that we seem to think, it's something for which there's actually research. Okay, employer priorities. I'm sure that every professional in this room has given a speech which makes these points: written and oral communication, teamwork skills, ethical decision-making, critical thinking, ability to apply knowledge in the real-world settings. So these are the types of skills that presumably employers are asking for, and certainly if these comes from surveys, so yes, that is indeed what they're saying. And once again, they're the types of skills that allow students to adapt. Now, there is some evidence about this. These are the light blue lines are, this graph follows students' earnings trajectory over their life. It goes out 11 years after college entry. So the light blue line shows the trajectory of students who get a certificate, which is a specific occupational degree, without very much soft skills. Whereas the dark blue line is for students with an associate degree, and those have a larger content of soft skills or liberal arts skills. You can see the difference here is that if you get a certificate, yes, your earnings go up, but they don't continue to go up. So the hypothesis is that the degree that students get, or the associate degrees, give them the types of skills that allow them to adapt, and despite the fact that technology is changing and their jobs are changing, their earnings can continue to grow. This is a study by Eric Hanashek. This is the one international thing I'm going to say today. He's had a study of 18 countries and basically finds that same trade-off, right? If you have occupational or vocational training, you can get into the labor market, you can get a good job, but your earnings don't continue to grow. So students who have more liberal arts or more soft skills training, their earnings continue to grow throughout their lifetime. So there's that trade-off. And there is an argument in the United States right now about the idea that we should give students specific occupational training and not bother with the types of things we get in universities. Now, this is not only conservatives. We do have a president who has that particular view, but there are many liberals who also think that's true. It's important to get people jobs right away. So this discussion between narrow, specific occupational versus more general skills that don't seem to be so applicable is an ongoing discussion. All right, so these are the types of things that we can do. I think I want to say that I think that the students who are going to Northwestern or to Harvard or to Berkeley, they're learning these things now. So the question really is, how is it that we can incorporate this type of education into the type of institutions or the type of education that students, lower income students now get to prepare them specifically for work. We have to combine those, and these are just some things, educational experiences that teach them to solve problems with people whose views are different from their own. Ethical issues and public debate's important in their field. Direct learning experiences working with others to solve problems important in their communities. So the question is, how can we incorporate those types of skills, those types of experiences into the education that all of our students get? So I do think that there are solutions to this. We need to think about the funding. If we want this to happen, we can't underfund these types of colleges and post-secondary institutions. We certainly have to be concerned about completion, as I said, but then also these types of ideas basically call for a different type of design, a different type of pedagogy. But I think that's not unknown. We know what that is, and in fact, we're doing it for the most part, I think, in our elite institutions. It's these types of institutions where we don't have that. So just to conclude, so I do think that technological change, the growth of AI, et cetera, will cause disruption, but I don't think it will be massive job loss at the absolute level. But there are problems with skills and the labor market that will be exacerbated by emerging technology, and post-secondary education has a crucial role to play, although it can't do it alone. We have been talking about the importance of general or soft skills for many years. The changes that we're now seeing will only make those skills more important. But let's not develop a system in which we have general and soft skills for the high-income students and focus on narrow and more specific vocational skills for low-income students. That will only increase the inequality and stratification of our education system. We need to apply those principles to community colleges or similar institutions, as well as to elite and selective universities. We must find a way to combine the teaching of vocational, occupational, specific, general, and soft skills at all levels of the education system. I think we know how to do that. We need to be willing to recognize the underlying problems and be committed to a solution and willing to make the investment. Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to organizers for inviting me here today. My name is Daniel Castro. I'm with the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. And so today what I want to do is talk about what I'd like to call the algorithmic economy. So if we look at the past 20 years and the trends we've seen in the economy, 20 years ago we were talking about the internet economy. So companies were competing based on what they were doing online and how well they could leverage the internet. Then we moved into the data economy, which is, I think, what we're really in today, where companies are competing based on how well they can exploit their information resources. But we're moving into the algorithmic economy, which is where companies are going to be competing based on how they can automate different processes and how they can make better decisions, all using artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence is the use of software that can imitate intelligent human behavior. And innovation with AI is really one of the most important opportunities we have to use technology to increase productivity. And we're seeing AI being used across virtually all sectors of the economy. And we've seen, of course, many studies that have estimated that the economic impact of this transformation will be in the trillions. Last year, my think tank did a study where we tried to really capture the state of the art in terms of how firms are using artificial intelligence, how they're using this technology. And we came up with 7 primary categories for how we're seeing this technology being used. So first, monitoring. So we see artificial intelligence being used to detect patterns in data. So a great example of this is credit card companies, that they process massive amounts of data and they're looking for fraudulent transactions. We're seeing AI being used for discovery, so to actually seek out new solutions to specific problems. We're seeing AI being used for predicting. So this is everything from forecasting the weather or market futures to the type of personalization or recommendation algorithms that you find in Amazon or Netflix or some of these digital platforms. Fourth, we have interpreting. So this is when AI is being used to extract meaning from data. So we see this in everything from analyzing government documents or legal documents to using AI in a medical scenario to look at X-ray lab results and interpret these results. And finally, we're seeing AI being used for interactions. And this falls into 3 categories: interactions with the environment, interactions with people, and this is where you have a lot of the advancements in fields like natural language processing, computer vision, and interactions with other machines, both intelligent and otherwise. And we're seeing that firms are putting all of these different functionalities together to create some really astounding results. And with that, we're seeing AI that's actually able to beat humans at many different things, from playing games, which we talked about earlier today, to diagnosing health conditions, as was mentioned earlier, to even doing things like transcribing speech or lip reading, a number of functions. And so what I think is really interesting about AI here is that AI keeps getting better. And it keeps getting better because of something called machine learning. It used to be that if you wanted to program a computer to be intelligent, you had to actually program in those specific steps. But with machine learning, what you do is you teach a computer how to learn. And then it can start solving these problems on its own. So this is a video of a computer that's playing this old Atari game, Breakout. So at the very beginning, you can see it wasn't very good. It was missing all the shots. Right about now, it's been training for a while. It's starting to play pretty well. It's about as good of an average beginner human player. And what's really interesting is, as it keeps training, it gets better and better. And it keeps getting better. And so eventually it becomes not only as good as the best human player out there, it discovers a new solution. Right? So it's discovered this new optimal solution for actually winning this game that no human can replicate. So at this point, the computer is better than any human that's out there. And this is the type of change that we're really seeing happen increasingly in many different areas. And so at this point, this is when people start getting kind of scared. And this is when people start thinking it will affect their job. And the idea is, I think, really well captured here in this poster that says, the bad news is the robot can do your job. The good news is that we're hiring robot repair technicians. The worst news is that we are building robot repairing robots, and we don't expect any more good news. And so this is really the headline that we're seeing play out again and again. Lots of studies are saying that jobs will be eliminated by artificial intelligence. The most notable one is this study from Frey and Osborne that came out 4 years ago that said 47% of US jobs would be eliminated over the next 20 years. They did that study again for the UK and had a similarly very high number. McKinsey Global Institute did this study a few years ago that said 110 to 140 million workers would be displaced by 2025. And these are the numbers that whenever you see an article about AI in the workforce, they're always referencing back to these studies. Even though it's been 4 years, every single article that you see is really going back to these studies. And there's some problems with that, which I want to talk about. But first of all, we've heard all these claims before. During the 1930s, a labor union wrote a letter to President Roosevelt where they were extolling the president. They were saying, we need to remove the loading machines from the coal mines. We need to complete all public work using only manpower. We need to take the tractors off the farm. And we need to go into the various industries and remove enough labor-displacing machines to make employment for everyone. And then a few years later, Congress was actually debating legislation to go and send the Secretary of Labor out to identify all the labor-saving devices that were out there and figure out how many new jobs they could create if they got rid of them. In the 1950s, this came up again. Congress created a joint economic committee that held extensive hearings on automation. And President Kennedy created an Office of Automation and Manpower in the Department of Labor. And this was an issue that was really at the top of his mind. In an interview in 1962, he was asked by a reporter about this issue of automation and jobs. And he said, "I regard it as the major domestic challenge, really, of the 60s, to maintain full employment at a time when automation is, of course, replacing men." This is a quote that could be said today, and it would not be seen out of place. Now, we hear all this history, and I think a lot of people say, but this time it's different. But what's interesting is artificial intelligence has also been around for a very long time. Although we're talking about it a lot more now, artificial intelligence goes back to the earliest days of computer science. And if you go back to the 1970s, and the 1980s, when AI was having a resurgence back then, we were hearing a lot of these same conversations at that time. So Marvin Minsky, who co-founded MIT's AI lab, said in 1970, in 3 to 8 years, we're going to have a machine with the general intelligence of an average human being. There was a labor economist, Gail Garfield Schwartz, who said in 1982 that with AI, as much as 20% of the workforce will be out of work in a generation. And then Niles Nilsson, who was a pioneer of AI at SRI labs in Stanford University, claimed in 1984 that we must convince our leaders that they should give up on the idea of full employment as a goal for the post-industrial economic system. It's unachievable, unnecessary, and undesirable. So we've seen these exact same claims that we're hearing today in the past. Now, of course, all of that alone still doesn't mean that the claims are wrong today. So let's look at the specific claims today and why I think they're wrong. So first of all, if you look at the major study, the Frey and Osborne study, it uses a very weak methodology for deciding what jobs are going to be automated. They basically took a study from the Department of Labor in the United States that classifies different types of jobs based on manual dexterity and social perceptiveness, and it assigns it a number. It's basically a very straightforward formula. And it says anything that scores below, happened to be 0.7 was their cutoff, is a job that's going to be automated. But when you actually go and then look at all the jobs that they say are going to be automated, it's not a very kind of believable study. So here's a list of some of the jobs that they think are going to be automated with artificial intelligence. Manicurists, fashion models, barbers, carpet installers, drywall installers, installation workers, bicycle repairers, dental technicians. We actually had a robot fashion model at one point, and that never really took off. So we at least know that job's pretty safe for now. But of course, all of that doesn't mean that no professions will be eliminated, which is why I raised my hand and said no to the initial question. Very specialized roles will certainly be eliminated. We've seen this in the past. So for example, in bowling alleys, we no longer have individuals working back there to reset the pins. We have an automatic pin setter machines. It also turns out that it's really hard to automate many jobs. And so what happens is that occupations, of course, actually change over time. So one use of AI that I personally use on a regular basis is a virtual assistant for scheduling meetings. So instead of doing the kind of typical back and forth where you say, can you grab coffee with me? Are you available tomorrow? No, I'm not available tomorrow. I'm available Friday. What time? You have all these emails that go back and forth. It's a big waste of time. There's a company out there called X.AI. You can use a virtual assistant that has that whole conversation in a completely normal conversational way with your colleagues, but leaves you out of the loop. And it looks at your calendar, it figures this all out. Now, of course, that's something that a real human assistant used to do in the past. When I started using X.AI, I didn't fire any assistants. I just, now the assistants can do other things. And that's really what we see in most of these fields. Occupations change. Humans and computers end up working together. And so one of my colleagues actually published a study earlier this year where they were looking at occupational churn, which is the rate at which some jobs expand and others contract, over the last 165 years. It turns out that occupational churn peaked at over 50% in the 2 decades between 1850 and 1870, and it's fallen to its lowest levels in the last 15 years, to around 10%. So for all the concern that we have about what jobs look like in the post-dot-com era and the financial crisis and everything that we've seen with AI and automation even in the recent years, it was 1850 to 1870 where you had the most rapid change in occupations. So it also turns out that some of the predictions that we hear about are actually quite insignificant. So one of the studies that's often cited is from the World Economic Forum. And this predicts that there's going to be a net employment impact between 5.1 million jobs lost to disruptive labor market changes over the period of 2015 to 2020, with a total loss of 7.1 million jobs. So 5.1 to 7.1 million jobs. And the headlines in the newspaper always paint this as this massive disruption, and so we kind of internalize that. But this is global job loss. So 5.1 million jobs lost over 5 years globally out of 3 billion workers. So 5 million jobs, 3 billion workers. That's nothing in this case. The second kind of misperception here, I think that the biggest misunderstanding is that some people believe an increase in productivity leads to higher unemployment. But if you look at changes in productivity in many nations over the past 20 years, there's really no correlation with unemployment. And so this chart up here, this is showing the G20 nations. Not all of them are labeled, but all of them have dots on there, and the correlation between unemployment and changes in productivity. You can also look at robotics. So there's similarly no correlation between countries' adoption of robotics and job loss in manufacturing. These things aren't actually related, even though people sometimes think they are. And in fact, what we really need to be having a conversation about is productivity. How can we increase productivity? Improvements in productivity are the single most important factor in growing GDP, reducing poverty, and improving standards of living. Every 1 percentage point increase in productivity on the US side is related to 500 billion additional in the US federal budget. Even more important than that, in some countries, it's not just if we want to improve our standard of living, we need to increase productivity, but in many countries we have aging populations. So if we even want to maintain our current standards of living, we need to increase productivity. So for example, in the EU, as the working age to older person ratio changes, and it's going to change from 3.5 to 2.2 by 2040, we need to see a 13% increase in productivity to keep after-tax worker income from changing. So aside from population growth, most job creation has stemmed from productivity-driven increases in purchasing power for consumers and businesses. And the reason this happens is because innovation allows workers and firms to produce more, and so wages go up and prices go down. And this is what results in increased spending, which in turn creates jobs in all these other occupations. It's not more jobs necessarily in the tech sector, it's more jobs in restaurants, more jobs for doctors, pharmacists, and other areas. And in fact, this is what we see historically in the data. So in no decade, when we went back in this 165 years, in no decade has technology directly created more jobs than it's eliminated. So we know for a fact that technology does destroy jobs, but that doesn't mean you have higher unemployment. Because relative to the job technology is creating, it's eliminating today fewer jobs now than in any decade since World War II. The problem that we have here is that the jobs that are eliminated are often significantly more visible than the jobs that are created. So for example, we see the ATMs on the street corners. And so we see that we have maybe fewer bank tellers, and we think this is something that's happening, and we don't recognize the extra restaurants that are opened up, the extra hotels, the extra services. And I want to go back to the question that was asked earlier about, you're in a room with a bunch of entrepreneurs, and they want to see change, and then you ask people, do they want to see change? And I do think that actually people want change, because if you ask someone, if you had an extra $100,000, would you do something different? The answer is always yes. And again, we can actually see this in the data. If you look at the differences in spending between middle-income earners and high-income earners, we see that high-income earners, they want to spend that extra money. They want to spend it on more education, on personal services, on hotels, airfare, travel, new cars and trucks, furniture and new appliances, and even on insurance. And so, I think the most important message here is that countries should not fear AI. They should really be thinking about how can they embrace it. And unfortunately, we're seeing some disturbing trends in this area, and this is where I spend most of my time, is really looking at policy. So, we see efforts to have, preemptive regulation that raises the risk of using the technology and lowers the return on investment. We see countries that are really applying what's called the precautionary principle instead of the permissionless innovation principle, which says we need to make sure that nothing goes wrong before we experiment with the new technology. In particular in Europe, with the General Data Protection Regulation, this is raising the cost on companies that want to share data. It's creating new rights, like the right to an explanation, that limits the use of AI in many fields. And I think what's troubling is that the EU is really pushing out these regulations through its trade agreements with many other countries around the world. And so there's a risk that not just Europe will kind of lose out in some ways because of this, but other countries will hurt themselves. And countries really need to be thinking about how they can embrace AI. There's a number of countries, China, Canada, even the UK, that have started creating national strategies around artificial intelligence. And what's interesting here is no country can really slow down AI for everyone. They can't slow it down globally. They can slow it down for themselves. And so countries should really be working on how can they better support R&D around AI? How can they help workers adjust? Because we do know that there will be an impact on workers. And how can they address the barriers to adoption, which is, I think, the piece that's often left out the most. Looking at the challenges of digital adoption, just like a lot of countries really spend a long time looking at broadband and creating national broadband strategies, we need to be having national AI strategies where we figure out how do we actually make this adoption work for us. To conclude, I just want to ask you to kind of think back to that video that I showed you of the computer playing this Atari game. And think about the AI at the very beginning versus the AI at the very end. Right now, every country is really they're in a race. They're trying to get their industries to be in that last part of the video. They want to be using AI so that they can win. And when they get to that stage, the countries that haven't made those investments are going to be like the very beginning of the video, trying to compete against the AI at the very end of the video. And they're not going to be able to do it. And that's why I think this important question that we're having today, where we're talking about the impact on workers, is important because we have to get over that fear so we can start moving forward with actually accelerating adoption. Because it's going to be one of the most important things for national competitiveness in virtually every country. So thank you again for the opportunity to be here today.